Products liability law in the United States has evolved significantly from traditional claims based solely on negligence or breach of warranty. Today, the dominant framework, especially for bar examination purposes, is strict products liability. This modern approach is primarily governed by the Restatement Third of Torts, products liability. The crucial shift here is moving away from fault in the process of making the product. Under strict liability, the focus is not on whether the manufacturer exercised reasonable care during manufacturing or inspection. Instead, liability attaches based solely on the condition of the product itself. Specifically, the product must be deemed defective and unreasonably dangerous when it leaves the defendant's control. This concept of liability without fault regarding the production process establishes the foundation for analyzing the three distinct categories of defects that trigger liability: manufacturing defects, design defects, and warning defects. As established, strict liability hinges on the product's defective condition when it leaves the manufacturer. To analyze liability under this framework, tort law categorizes these defects into three distinct, though sometimes overlapping, types. First, we have manufacturing defects. This occurs when an individual unit deviates, or varies, from the manufacturer's own specifications. Second, design defects. Here, the entire product line is flawed because the blueprint itself is inherently dangerous, even if every unit was built exactly as intended. Finally, we address warning defects, which involve the failure to provide adequate instructions or warnings about non-obvious dangers associated with the product's intended or foreseeable misuse. This chapter serves as our roadmap. In the following segments, we will explore each of these three categories in depth, beginning with the manufacturing defect. We now commence our detailed examination of the first category, the manufacturing defect. This defect arises when an individual product unit deviates, or varies, from the manufacturer's own intended design specifications. Crucially, liability attaches here even if the manufacturer exercised all possible care in the preparation, inspection, and marketing of that specific item. The focus is entirely on the deviation from the blueprint, not on the quality control process itself. Think of this as the classic one bad apple scenario. Imagine a batch of 1,000 identical bicycles, all built perfectly according to the engineering drawings, except for one. Perhaps in that single unit, a critical bolt was made from substandard alloy, or it was installed improperly during assembly. If that single faulty component causes the bicycle to fail during normal use, that unit is deemed to have a manufacturing defect, rendering the seller strictly liable for the resulting harm, regardless of how careful they were. Having analyzed manufacturing defects, where the problem lies in the execution of the plan, we now transition to the second major category, design defects. A design defect is fundamentally different because the entire product line is flawed, even if every single unit was manufactured perfectly according to the blueprint. The flaw resides in the very concept or blueprint of the product itself. To address this, many jurisdictions historically relied upon the consumer expectation test. This traditional standard asks a simple question: did the product fail to perform as safely as an ordinary consumer would expect when used in an intended or reasonably foreseeable manner? If the ordinary user expects a toaster to not spontaneously combust, and it does, it fails this test. However, this test often proves inadequate, especially for complex products like automobiles or medical devices, where consumer expectations about inherent safety levels are difficult to quantify or may be unrealistically low. We will see shortly how courts have largely moved toward a more objective balancing approach for these complex cases. As we noted, the consumer expectation test often falls short for complex products. Consequently, most jurisdictions, following the Restatement III of torts, have adopted the risk-utility test as the dominant standard for evaluating design defects. This test shifts the focus from subjective consumer expectations to an objective balancing of factors. The central inquiry is whether the risks inherent in the product's design outweigh the utility provided by that design. If the danger outweighs the benefit, the design is deemed defective. Courts weigh several key factors in this balancing act. First, they assess the gravity and foreseeability of the potential danger posed by the design. Second, and critically important, they examine the feasibility of a reasonably safer alternative design. This includes considering the technical feasibility of the alternative and, importantly, the economic cost associated with implementing that safer alternative. If a much safer, yet affordable, alternative existed, the original design is much more likely to be deemed defective. This objective balancing forms the core of modern design defect litigation. We now focus specifically on the feasible alternative design, or FAD, requirement, which is often central to winning or losing under the risk-utility analysis. For a plaintiff to successfully argue a design defect based on risk outweighing utility, they generally must demonstrate a crucial element, that a reasonably safer alternative design existed when the product was manufactured. This is not merely about proving that a safer design could exist today. The requirement mandates that the plaintiff show the alternative was both technically feasible and economically viable at the time the defendant put the original product into the stream of commerce. This critical temporal element shifts the focus away from pure hindsight, what we know now, to what was reasonably possible and practical when the design decision was originally made. Proving the existence of a viable, feasible alternative design is often the most challenging evidentiary hurdle for plaintiffs in design defect cases. Having analyzed defects related to how a product is made or how it is designed, we now turn to the third category under strict products liability: warning defects, often called failure to warn or inadequate instructions. Manufacturers have a duty to warn consumers about risks associated with the product's intended use, and also risks arising from reasonably foreseeable misuse. Crucially, this duty generally does not extend to dangers that are open and obvious to the ordinary user. If a danger is readily apparent, like the risk of burning yourself on a hot stove, the law assumes the user already knows the risk, and no specific warning is required. The focus here is on latent, non-obvious dangers that the manufacturer knows or should know about, but which the average consumer would not anticipate. The warning must be clear, conspicuous, and convey the magnitude of the potential harm. Now we examine crucial limitations on the scope of the duty to warn, particularly concerning who the warning must reach. For prescription drugs, courts frequently apply the learned intermediary doctrine. Under this doctrine, the manufacturer's duty to warn is satisfied by providing adequate warnings to the prescribing physician, the learned intermediary, rather than directly to the patient. The rationale is that the doctor possesses the expertise to weigh the risks and benefits for the specific patient. Similarly, the sophisticated user defense applies when the product is sold to someone who, by profession or experience, already understands the inherent dangers. In such cases, the manufacturer owes no duty to warn that user about obvious dangers known within that specialized field. Regardless of who receives the warning itself must be adequate. Adequacy is judged on three fronts. The content must fully explain the risk, the placement must ensure visibility, and the prominence must be sufficient to catch the user's attention and convey the seriousness of the danger. We have now completed our detailed analysis of the three distinct pathways to establishing strict products liability. First, the manufacturing defect, where the product deviates from the manufacturer's own specifications, the classic one bad apple. Second, the design defect, an inherent flaw in the blueprint itself, analyzed primarily through the risk-utility balancing test or, in some jurisdictions, the consumer expectation test. Third, the warning defect, arising from the failure to adequately inform users about latent dangers associated with intended or foreseeable misuse. Successfully proving any one of these three defects establishes liability based on the product's defective condition when it left the defendant's control. However, establishing liability is often only the first step. Once a plaintiff proves a defect, the focus shifts to potential defenses available to the manufacturer, such as comparative fault or the plaintiff's assumption of the risk. These crucial defenses will be the subject of our next discussion.